The mop hit the floor with a wet slap, and 3 soldiers burst out laughing. "Watch where you're going." "Old man," Staff Sergeant Mike Brennan sneered. Stepping around the spill without breaking stride, the janitor, a gray-haired man in a worn blue uniform, said nothing. He just bent down, wrung out the mop, and continued working. His name tag read simply, J. Morrison. What those soldiers didn't know was that J. Morrison wasn't just a janitor. He was General James Morrison, the newly appointed commanding officer of Fort Bragg, and he was about to change their lives forever. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand how 3 soldiers ended up destroying their military careers in under 60 seconds, we need to go back to where this all started 3 days earlier, in the Pentagon. General James Morrison sat in his Pentagon office, staring at the folder in front of him. The words Fort Bragg Disciplinary Concerns were stamped across the top in red ink. For 35 years, Morrison had served his country. He'd led men through 3 combat deployments, earned the Distinguished Service Cross, and risen through the ranks to become one of the Army's most respected 4-star generals. Now, at the end of his career, he'd been given one final mission: clean up Fort Bragg. The base had a problem. Discipline was slipping. Respect was eroding. Junior soldiers were cutting corners, and senior NCOs were looking the other way. The previous commander had tried the traditional approach: inspections, meetings, stern speeches. Nothing worked. Morrison had a different plan. "Sir, are you sure about this?" His aide, Colonel Sarah Chun, stood in the doorway with a skeptical expression. Morrison closed the folder. "When I was a private, my drill sergeant told me something I never forgot. You can't fix what you can't see. If I show up in my uniform with stars on my shoulders, everyone will put on a show. I need to see what's really happening when they think no one important is watching. Going undercover as a janitor is unconventional." So was storming Normandy. Morrison stood, already unbuttoning his uniform jacket. "Set it up, Sarah. I want to be on base by Monday. And make sure only you and the base operations officer know who I really am." 3 days later, J. Morrison reported for his first day of work at Fort Bragg. The SOL Dear Staff Sergeant Mike Brennan had been in the Army for 8 years, and he'd learned one important lesson. Appearances were everything. Look sharp, sound confident, and nobody questioned you, especially not the lower-ranking soldiers who followed him around like puppies. His 2 shadows today were Specialist Danny Torres and Private First Class Kevin Wright. Torres was ambitious, always trying to impress Brennan with jokes and bravado. Wright was newer, still figuring out how to fit in, eager to be accepted. They were walking through the maintenance building when Brennan spotted the janitor mopping the hallway floor. "Hey, old-timer," Brennan called out. "You missed a spot." The janitor looked up briefly, nodded, and continued mopping. Torres laughed. "I don't think he heard you, Sergeant. They never do." Brennan walked past, deliberately stepping in the wet area the janitor had just cleaned, leaving muddy boot prints across the floor. "Oops." Wright hesitated, uncomfortable. "Sergeant, he just cleaned that, so he can clean it again. That's his job." Brennan kept walking. "Come on, we've got real work to do." Behind them, the janitor said nothing. He simply wrung out his mop and started over, but his eyes calm, observant, and memorizing everything told a different story. Morrison spent his second day cleaning the dining facility. He scrubbed tables, emptied trash cans, and listened. "Did you finish that maintenance report?" One sergeant asked another. "Nah, I just copied last month's and changed the date." Nobody actually reads those things. Morrison made a mental note. At lunch, Brennan and his group sat at a corner table. Morrison was wiping down the table next to them when he heard Brennan's voice rise. "The problem with this base," Brennan was saying loudly, "is that standards have gotten too soft. Back in the day, Soldiers had respect. Now we've got generals sitting in air-conditioned offices, worried about feelings and diversity training, while those of us doing real work get ignored. Torres nodded enthusiastically. Man, if I was in charge, I'd run things different. No more political correctness. Just straight-up discipline. Morrison moved closer, spraying cleaner on an already clean table. You see that, Janitor? Brennan gestured toward Morrison without looking at him. That's probably some vet who couldn't hack it. 20 years of doing the bare minimum. Now he's cleaning up after real soldiers. Wright shifted uncomfortably. How do you know he didn't serve? Look at him. Brennan's voice dripped with contempt. Soft hands, slow movements. That guy never saw combat. Probably never left the States. Morrison's jaw tightened slightly, the only sign of his reaction. His hands, actually, bore scars from shrapnel wounds in Fallujah. His slow movements were deliberate, the result of 3 decades of learning patience under pressure. He finished wiping the table and moved on without a word. But he remembered every sentence. Day 3. The Sionafaronti Ation incident in the hallway happened on Morrison's 3rd day. He'd been mopping the administrative building's main corridor when Brennan's group came through. They were in a hurry, talking loudly about weekend plans. Morrison had signs up, "Wet floor, please use side entrance." Brennan saw the signs. He looked directly at them, and then he walked straight through the wet area anyway, his boots tracking mud across the freshly cleaned floor. Watch where you're going. Old man, Brennan said when Morrison's mop nearly touched his boot. Torres followed, laughing. Maybe he needs to clean his glasses. Wright hung back, clearly uncomfortable, but didn't say anything. Morrison straightened up slowly. For just a moment, decades of command authority flickered in his eyes. But then it was gone, replaced by the tired expression of a janitor who'd seen this behavior 100 times. Sorry, sir, Morrison said quietly. I'll clean that right up. Yeah, you do that. Brennan started to walk away, then turned back. And next time, put up signs or something so people know you're working. Morrison gestured to the 3 signs clearly visible on either end of the hallway. Brennan's face reddened. Don't get smart with me. You're just a janitor. Yes, sir? Just a janitor. Brennan stepped closer, lowering his voice to a threatening whisper that only Morrison could hear. You got a problem, old man? Because I can make your life very difficult around here. I know the base commander personally. 1 word from me, and you're looking for a new job. Morrison looked up at him, really looked at him for the first time. And something in that gaze made Brennan take an involuntary step back. But then Morrison dropped his eyes. No problem, sir. I'll be more careful. You do that. Brennan walked away, not noticing the cold smile that briefly crossed Morrison's face. Torres caught up to Brennan. Man, you really put him in his place. Somebody has to teach these people respect. What none of them saw was Colonel Chun, Morrison's aide, watching from an office doorway. She'd witnessed the entire exchange, and the expression on her face suggested that Staff Sergeant Brennan's days at Fort Bragg were numbered. The investigation deepening us over the next 4 days, Morrison continued his undercover work. He cleaned offices and found falsified reports. He emptied trash cans and discovered evidence of missing equipment. He mopped floors and overheard conversations about soldiers covering for each other's mistakes. But most importantly, he watched how leadership treated people they considered beneath them. Some officers and NCOs were respectful, thanking him for his work, holding doors, treating him like a human being. Others were like Brennan, dismissive, rude, viewing anyone in a service position as invisible or inferior. Morrison took detailed notes each night, building a comprehensive picture of Fort Bragg's real culture. And the more he saw, the more convinced he became that the base's problems ran deeper than paperwork and procedures. This was about respect, integrity, and the fundamental values that were supposed to define military service. On his 7th day undercover, Morrison decided it was time to end the experiment. He scheduled a mandatory base-wide formation for the following morning. Every soldier, from private to colonel, was required to attend. Nobody knew why. The announcement just said, "New commanding general's first address." The formation took place in Fort Bragg's main parade ground. Over 3,000 soldiers stood in neat rows, speculation buzzing through the ranks. "I heard the new general is a hard-ass," someone whispered. "My sergeant said he's some Pentagon desk jockey who's never seen real action. Just another speech about values, and then back to business as usual." Brennan stood with his platoon, arms crossed, looking bored. I give it 20 minutes before he starts talking about teamwork and respect. "They're all the same." Torres nodded. "Think we'll actually meet him, or just see him from a distance?" "Generals don't mingle with enlisted. We'll probably never even see him up close." On the stage, Colonel Chun stood at the microphone. "Attention on deck." 3,000 soldiers snapped to attention. "I want to tell you about your new commanding general," Chun began. "General James Morrison has served this country for 35 years. He's led soldiers in 3 combat deployments. He holds the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, and the Purple Heart with 3 oak leaf clusters. He's commanded at every level from platoon to division." She paused, looking out at the formation. "But before General Morrison addresses you today, I want to share what he's been doing for the past week." A murmur rippled through the formation. Chun gestured to the side of the stage. "General Morrison, would you please join us?" Every eye turned to the stairs, expecting to see a figure in dress uniform, with stars gleaming on the shoulders. Instead, a man in a blue janitor's uniform walked onto the stage. The formation erupted in confused whispers. Brennan's face went white. No way. "That's not—" Morrison walked to the microphone, still wearing his janitor uniform and name tag. For a long moment, he just looked out at the assembled soldiers, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke. "For the past 7 days, I've been working on this base as a janitor. I've cleaned your offices, mopped your floors, and emptied your trash cans. And I've learned more about Fort Bragg in 1 week than I could have learned in a year of official briefings." The silence was absolute. "I've seen some of you falsify maintenance reports. I've heard conversations about missing equipment that nobody wanted to report. I've watched senior NCOs cut corners and junior soldiers follow their example." Morrison's voice hardened. "But most importantly, I've experienced firsthand how some of you treat people you consider beneath you. People you think don't matter. People whose work you depend on every single day, but whose dignity you don't respect." He pulled a small notebook from his pocket. "I have names. I have dates. I have direct quotes. And starting tomorrow, we're going to have some very serious conversations about what it means to serve with honor." Brennan felt his stomach drop. "But before we get to accountability," Morrison continued, "I want to talk about 3 soldiers in particular." Chun handed him a folder. Staff Sergeant Michael Brennan, Specialist Daniel Torres, Private First Class Kevin Wright, front and center. The walk to the stage was the longest of Brennan's life. Every soldier in the formation watched as he, Torres, and Wright marched forward. Brennan's mind raced, trying to remember every interaction with the janitor with the general over the past week. That they stopped at the base of the stage. Standing at attention, Morrison looked down at them from the microphone. "Staff Sergeant Brennan, do you remember what you said to me in the cafeteria? About generals sitting in air-conditioned offices, worried about feelings instead of real work." Brennan's voice came out as a croak. "Yes, sir. Do you remember stepping through a clearly marked wet floor area, tracking mud across work I'd just completed, and then threatening my employment when I didn't show you sufficient gratitude? Yes, sir. Do you remember telling me I was just a janitor? Yes, sir. Morrison descended the stairs, stopping directly in front of Brennan. Up close, the steel in the general's eyes was unmistakable. You were right about one thing, Sergeant. Standards have gotten soft, but not because generals care about respect and dignity. Standards have gotten soft because soldiers like you think rank gives you permission to treat other human beings as less than. Because you've confused authority with superiority. Because you've forgotten the most basic principle of military service. We're all on the same team. He stepped back, addressing all three soldiers. Private Wright, you're dismissed. Return to your unit. Wright blinked, confused. Sir, I watched you hesitate. I saw your discomfort. You didn't participate in the disrespect, and you questioned your sergeant's behavior. That took courage. You're the kind of soldier this base needs. Dismissed. Thank you, sir. Wright saluted sharply and practically ran back to formation. Morrison turned to Torres. Specialist Torres, you're reassigned effective immediately. You'll spend the next month working with base maintenance and janitorial services. Maybe after walking in their shoes, you'll learn that every job in the Army matters. Every person deserves respect. Dismissed. Torres saluted and left, his face burning with shame. That left Brennan, standing alone. Staff Sergeant Brennan, you told me you knew the base commander personally. You said one word from you could cost me my job. Morrison's voice was quiet, but it carried across the silent parade ground. You were trying to intimidate someone you thought had no power, someone you thought couldn't fight back. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. He handed Brennan a folder. That's your Article 15 paperwork. Non-judicial punishment for conduct unbecoming. You're reduced in rank to sergeant. You're reassigned from leadership duties to inventory management. And you'll be attending a mandatory course on military values and professional conduct. Brennan took the folder with shaking hands. But here's the thing, Sergeant. Morrison leaned in close. I'm not punishing you because you disrespected a general. I'm punishing you because you disrespected a janitor. And in the United States Army, that's supposed to mean the same thing. Dismissed. Brennan saluted and turned to leave. His career in tatters, his reputation destroyed, all because he couldn't show basic human decency to someone he considered beneath him. Morrison returned to the microphone. Let me be clear. This base will change. Not because I'm cracking down. Not because I'm a hard ass. But because we're going to remember why we serve. We protect people. We stand for something bigger than ourselves. And if you can't treat a janitor with respect, you have no business leading soldiers into combat. He looked out at the formation, his voice firm but not harsh. Excellence starts with character. Character starts with respect. Respect starts with recognizing that every person, regardless of rank, position, or job, has inherent dignity and worth. That's not political correctness. That's not weakness. That's what separates us from our enemies. That's what makes us professional soldiers. The formation remained silent, but now it was an attentive silence, not a shocked one. I don't expect perfection. I expect effort. I expect integrity. And I expect you to treat each other and everyone on this base the way you'd want to be treated. Morrison straightened. Now let's get to work. Dismissed. The change at Fort Bragg didn't happen overnight, but it happened. Brennan completed his course on military values and eventually regained respect from his peers, not through intimidation, but through genuine growth. He learned that true leadership meant serving those under your command, not lording authority over them. Torres finished his month with maintenance and janitorial services. The experience humbled him, He made friends with the permanent staff, learned about their lives and challenges, and gained a new appreciation for the people who kept the base running. When he returned to his unit, he became an advocate for treating all base personnel with dignity. Wright was promoted to specialist and took Brennan's former leadership position. He led by example, showing that courage sometimes meant speaking up when something was wrong. As for Morrison, his unconventional approach became legendary. Articles appeared in military journals. Other commanders began adopting similar undercover assessments. The Janitor General became a symbol of the principle that true leaders never forget where they came from and never stop checking their own assumptions. But perhaps the most significant change was in the base's culture. Soldiers started noticing the people who kept things running: the janitors, the cooks, the maintenance workers, the administrative staff. They learned names. They said thank you. They held doors. Small gestures. But small gestures, multiplied across thousands of interactions every day, transformed the entire environment. 6 months into his command, Morrison was walking through the administrative building in his proper uniform this time, stars gleaming on his shoulders. When he passed a young private mopping the hallway floor, the private snapped to attention. "Good morning, sir." Morrison returned the salute. "Good morning, soldier. Thank you for keeping this place clean. I know it's not glamorous work, but it matters." The private's face lit up. "Thank you, sir. I appreciate that." As Morrison continued down the hall, he smiled, not because he'd given a compliment, but because the private had been mopping around two young sergeants who'd stepped aside to let him work, waiting patiently for him to finish before walking through. They'd learned the lesson that Staff Sergeant Brennan learned the hard way. Others were learning through example. Rank doesn't measure worth. Position doesn't determine value. And the true test of your character isn't how you treat your superiors. It's how you treat people who can do nothing for you in return. That janitor you dismissed? That could be your commanding general in disguise. Or more importantly, it could be a human being who deserves your respect simply because they're human. And in the end, that's the only lesson that really matters.